The year was 1946, and the lingering smoke of war still clung to the United States like a shadow that refused to lift. In the lowlands of North Carolina, where pine forests towered over red clay roads and the nights carried a silence heavy enough to feel like warning, a group of black veterans returned home wearing uniforms that the country respected abroad but despised on its own soil. Among them was Corporal Solomon Reed, a Marine whose hands still trembled from the memory of Pacific gunfire, yet whose heart beat with a steadiness carved from disciplined faith and the unyielding belief that dignity was not a privilege but a birthright. He arrived in a land where the Klan moved like a poisonous fog, unseen at first, then suffocating everything it touched. The war had taught Solomon many things: how to fire a rifle in darkness, how to trust a brother's breath beside him in a foxhole, how to hold fear without letting it govern him. But nothing on any battlefield had prepared him for the cruel irony of returning home to face enemies who called themselves neighbors and wore their hatred as if it were sacred duty. The KKK, emboldened by the quiet acquiescence of local sheriffs, had begun a new wave of terror, burning crosses at the edge of black farmlands, dragging veterans from their beds, and preaching that a black man trained in combat was the greatest danger to the old order. Rumors spread like wildfire of another attack brewing in the dark. Woods, and for every whisper, Solomon felt the weight of his uniform grow heavier. The story begins on a cold November night when the wind carried the faint scent of river water and gun oil, and a thin crescent moon hung low above the treetops like the curved blade of fate itself. Solomon stood on the porch of his family's small cabin, listening to the distant rumble of truck engines where there should have been only cicadas. The land felt restless, as though the soil itself knew what was coming. In that trembling quiet, he understood that the war he thought he had survived had only changed its shape. And as the first crackle of torches appeared on the horizon, he realized something even deeper. This time, he would not be fighting for a flag or a nation. He would be fighting for the right to exist on the land his ancestors had bled to claim. The night unfolded with a tension so sharp it felt carved into the bark of the pines that surrounded Solomon Reed's home. He could sense movement beyond the tree line, the faint crunch of boots stirring the fallen needles, the quiet exchange of voices that carried the unmistakable cadence of men preparing for violence. The air smelled of damp soil, cold smoke, and something metallic, an omen he recognized from battlefields oceans away. His breath steadied as he stepped off the porch, the distant glow of approaching torches staining the horizon with a thin, sinister orange. Though fear tugged at the edges of his mind, he let it settle like a familiar weight. Combat had taught him that survival began not with courage, but with clarity. Tonight, clarity whispered that the Klan wasn't hunting blindly. They were coming for him. Solomon's boots pressed quietly into the earth as he moved toward the back of the property, where a narrow path wound through the pines like a dark vein. He knew the land as intimately as he knew the feel of a rifle against his shoulder. Every step, every root, every shift of wind carried a meaning he had learned as a child. The memory of his father's voice rose within him. "Know the land, son. It can be a weapon or a witness." And tonight, he needed it to be both. Ahead, the shadows grew restless, shapes flickering between trunks, with the stiff posture of men convinced they owned the darkness. He crouched low, feeling the cold kiss of the ground through his palms, listening to the rhythm of their footsteps. They were closing in, slowly, deliberately, certain their presence alone could suffocate resistance. But Solomon was not alone. A soft rustle signaled the arrival of Sergeant Lewis Carter, emerging from the trees with the silent confidence of a man forged by the same war-torn crucible. Behind him stepped two more Marines, men who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Solomon on beaches where death came in waves. their breath condensed in the frigid air as they gathered beneath the towering pines, every face etched with resolve rather than fear. No words were exchanged. They had spoken all of this before, in glances, in plans whispered over lanterns, in the shared understanding that the Klan had mistaken them for victims. Tonight, these veterans, dismissed, belittled, unwelcomed, moved like a single living force. And as the torches grew nearer, their formation tightened, ready not simply to defend, but to strike first. The forest held its breath as the Marines shifted into position, the cold earth beneath them pulsing with the echo of approaching hooves. Solomon raised his hand, signaling silence, and the others froze as though carved from the very trunks that surrounded them. The Klan's voices drifted through the dark, confident, careless, thick with the arrogance of men who believed fear itself marched at their side. Their torches hissed softly, the flames bending in the wind like trembling tongues of warning. Solomon felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not of panic, but of preparation. In the Pacific, he had learned that victory depended on moments like this, moments when sound narrowed, breath thinned, and the world reduced itself to the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. Tonight, that rhythm echoed through him with a clarity that cut through the cold. He watched the men draw nearer, their white robes ghosting between the trees like twisted shadows. Lewis Carter leaned close, his voice barely a thread of air. 3 riders, 2 on foot, he whispered, studying the staggered pattern of torchlight as it filtered through the branches. Solomon nodded, tracing every movement, measuring the ground between them. The plan had been simple. Wait, observe, strike only when the advantage belonged unquestionably to them. Yet as the Klan advanced, he sensed a shift, a recklessness in their steps, a sloppiness in their spacing, as if they assumed the darkness itself bowed to their command. Their leader rode at the center, tall and rigid, the sleeve of his robe embroidered with a crimson cross that glowed faintly in the firelight. The sight of it stirred a slow fire within Solomon, a flame fed by memories of brothers lost overseas, men who had died fighting tyranny abroad only to have it waiting for them at home. The Klan spoke in low, amused tones, unaware that they were drifting deeper into a trap woven from discipline, patience, and righteous fury. When the riders reached the clearing's edge, Solomon exhaled once, steady and controlled, and the world seemed to narrow around that breath. The moment hung suspended, fragile, electric, the last heartbeat before action. He lifted his hand again, this time signaling advance. The Marines moved like shadows, unbound, stepping from the tree line with a precision so quiet it felt supernatural. They spread in a crescent formation, each man drawing upon the training that had carried them through the chaos of battlefields far from home. The Klan, startled by the sudden movement in the dark, faltered. One torch dropped, spitting sparks across the ground. Solomon stepped forward, posture unbroken, the darkness framing him like a mantle. For the first time that night, the Klan hesitated. Not because of weapons drawn, but because of the unmistakable sight of men who no longer feared dying. The forest shifted, the air thickened, and the balance of power turned with the subtle, unstoppable force of a rising tide. The clearing tightened around them like a fist, every branch seeming to lean inward, as if the forest itself wished to witness what was about to unfold. Solomon stepped closer, allowing the dim torchlight to reveal just enough of his face for recognition to take root. The lead rider's posture hardened, his gloved hand tightening around the reins, the flame of his torch reflecting off the pale cloth of his hood like a stain of borrowed power. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The silence pressed against the ears, thick, almost wet, like the air before a storm breaks. Solomon's gaze held steady, neither pleading nor provoking, simply refusing to yield. It was a look born not from rebellion, but from the knowledge that dignity, once claimed, could not be surrendered without betraying everything a man had ever survived. The rider's jaw tightened beneath the cloth, the first tremor of fear weaving through his arrogance as he realized these were not men he could intimidate. Lewis Carter shifted his stance, the soft crunch of pine needles breaking the stillness like a warning shot. Behind him, Private Brooks and Corporal Haynes formed a silent wall, their silhouettes sharpened by years of discipline that no hatred could erase. The Klan members glanced at one another, uncertain now, their earlier confidence dissolving into hesitation that clung to them like frost. One of the men on foot stepped back, his torch sputtering as if echoing his doubt. Solomon recognized the flicker of cowardice in him. It was the same flicker he had seen in enemy soldiers overseas, when they realized the men they faced would rather die standing than live bowed. The lead rider forced a laugh, brittle and strained, trying to reclaim the dominance slipping through his grasp. "You boys think this is your land?" he sneered. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the tremor beneath. Solomon did not answer. Instead, he stepped forward again, his silence heavier than any threat. In that fragile shift of power, the forest seemed to exhale. A sudden gust swept through the pines, bending the torch flames sideways and showering the clearing with sparks that danced like restless spirits. The unintended flare illuminated the Marines in stark, unforgiving detail. Broad shoulders, squared jaws, eyes hardened not by hatred but by history. It illuminated the rifles slung across their backs, the disciplined angle of their feet, the subtle synchronization of their breath. The Klan saw it all, and something in their formation faltered. For the first time, they understood that the darkness no longer belonged to them. Solomon raised his chin slightly, a gesture so small it felt like a whisper, but its meaning roared through the clearing. It said, "You will not pass, not tonight." And as the wind settled, the torches flickering weakly against the weight of their presence, the night shifted from threat to reckoning, marking the moment the Klan realized the hunters were no longer alone. In these woods, the lead rider's torch hissed as the wind twisted around him, licking at the frayed edges of his robe, as though trying to strip away the illusion of authority he clung to. He shifted in the saddle, the leather creaking beneath him, a sound too slight to hide the tremor that had crept into his hands. Solomon watched him carefully, measuring the moment with the precision of a man trained to read danger in the smallest flicker of movement. The forest had grown unnervingly, still, as if every creature, every owl, every restless branch, understood that the fragile boundary between violence and justice was thinning like breath on glass. Solomon's voice finally broke the silence, low and steady, carrying the weight of men who had bled for a country that refused to claim them. "Turn back," he said, not as a plea, but as an instruction. The words fell heavy, like stones dropped into cold water. The rider's response cracked under its own bravado. "You forget your place," he spat, though his voice quivered like a frayed rope. He raised his hand as if to signal the others forward, but his gesture faltered mid-air when Lewis Carter stepped into fuller view, his boots sinking firmly into the earth with the grounded strength of a man who had faced fire and refused to bow. The Marines closed their formation with the quiet certainty of men who had learned to trust the space between their heartbeats. Private Brooks positioned himself at the far left, eyes sharpened with unwavering focus, while Haynes steadied the center, his breath slow and even. They said nothing. They didn't need to. Their unity was its own language, one the Klan had never learned to read and never thought black men capable of speaking. The rider's bravado wavered, retreat flickering behind his eyes, but arrogance rarely dies quietly. One of the robed men on foot lunged forward, torch lifted as though fire could cow the veteran standing before him. Its light, flared wildly, casting monstrous shadows across the clearing and igniting the sharp scent of burning resin from the pine branches overhead. Solomon's hand moved with disciplined swiftness, signaling the line to hold, and the Marines responded instantly, their formation tightening like a vice. The advancing Klansman hesitated mid-step as he realized he stood alone, separated from the false courage of his group and exposed under the unblinking torchlight. His breath hitched. The fire crackled, and in that suspended instant, the balance shifted fully, away from hate, away from intimidation, and into a quiet reckoning shaped by men who had defended freedom abroad only to be forced to fight for it again at home. The lone Klansman's torch sputtered as he staggered back, its flame shrinking to a thin, trembling thread that painted fear across the white folds of his robe. Behind him, the other riders remained frozen, their horses shifting uneasily, sensing a shift their masters refused to acknowledge. Solomon stepped forward with the deliberate calm of a man who understood that strength was not always in the pull of a trigger, but in the unwavering steadiness of one's presence. His shadow stretched long across the clearing, carried by the restless torchlight that now seemed to favor the Marines over the men who had once ruled the night. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of smoke and the fragile certainty that every man present knew the line. Between survival and consequence had thinned to its final strand. Solomon didn't raise his weapon. He didn't need to. His voice alone was enough to crack the silence. "Go home," he said, each word carved with the dignity the world kept trying to deny him. The command rippled through the clearing like a cold wind. The rider nearest him jerked upright in the saddle, the leather reins squealing as his grip tightened. Anger rose in him, fierce and desperate, born not from courage, but from humiliation, a poison he could not swallow quietly. "You don't order me," he barked, though the quiver in his tone betrayed him. His horse stepped sideways, hooves sinking into the damp earth with a muffled thud. The flames shivered, casting distorted shadows across his hooded face. Lewis Carter shifted subtly, his stance widening, eyes tracking every movement with the sharp intuition of a soldier who had survived too many ambushes to trust stillness. Corporal Haynes steadied his breath, fingers hovering near the stock of his rifle but never tightening, embodying the discipline that separated trained warriors from frantic aggressors. The tension grew so taut, it seemed the trees themselves leaned closer to listen. Then, without warning, the second rider snapped. He jerked his torch upward, its flame exploding into a fierce bloom that crackled with reckless heat. "Enough!" he roared, the sound rasping through the forest like a wounded animal. He tried to spur his horse forward, but the animal balked, sensing the peril better than its master. The sudden flare illuminated every face in the clearing, the fear behind the hoods, the composure etched into the Marines, and the steady fire in Solomon's eyes. In that raw blaze of light, the Klan saw themselves reflected not as conquerors, but as men trembling before those they believed powerless. Solomon stepped closer, the glow outlining the hardened lines of a soldier who had learned that survival sometimes required standing without flinching. "If you cross this line," he said, his voice low, level, and unshaken, "you won't leave this forest as you came." The torch crackled louder, the wind held its breath, and for the first time the night bent not toward violence, but toward judgment. The torch's furious glow wavered as the wind whipped through the clearing, carrying embers upward like restless spirits clawing for escape. The second rider's grip faltered, his bravado melting, beneath the weight of the moment as the flame sputtered dangerously close to his sleeve. His horse reared, hooves slicing the cold air, forcing him to clutch the saddle horn with a desperation he could no longer disguise. Solomon held his ground, inhaling the scent of burning pitch and damp pine, his senses sharpening with the clarity of a man who had survived ambushes far more lethal than this. He could feel the forest turning against the intruders, its shadows thickening, its silence deepening. The Klan had come expecting fear to greet them. Instead, they found calm, discipline, and a refusal to bend. That truth unsettled them more than any weapon could have done. Lewis Carter stepped forward, the faint scuff of his boots echoing like distant thunder beneath the canopy. His presence alone sent a ripple through the line of robed men. They recoiled instinctively, as if the very sight of him pierced the illusion that their robes made them untouchable. The firelight settled across his face, revealing the quiet composure of a man who had once stormed enemy trenches under a sky bursting with artillery. Haynes and Brooks mirrored his stance, forming a united front whose strength radiated through the clearing like a rising tide. Solomon sensed the shift, the Klan's confidence unraveling thread by thread, replaced now by the creeping realization that these Marines stood not as individuals, but as brothers forged by war. The night itself seemed to lean toward them, listening as breath after breath steadied into a single, unwavering rhythm. The lead rider's mask twisted with frustration, his shoulders rising and falling with uneven breaths. He scanned the faces before him, searching for a crack, a hint of weakness that might restore his dwindling sense of control. But the Marines offered him nothing, not fear, not anger, not chaos, only stillness, only certainty. His hand twitched toward his holster, a desperate attempt to reclaim authority, but Solomon moved first, not with violence, but with a single step that carried the weight of a man who refused to be hunted on his own land. The shift was subtle, but its meaning thundered. "Leave," Solomon said, voice low and stripped of any tremor. "The night's already told you this isn't yours." The rider's breath caught, the forest held still, and in that suspended instant the Klan felt something unfamiliar settling into their bones. Defeat. A cold stillness swept through the clearing, settling over the pine needles like a veil as the lead rider's authority crumbled beneath the weight of his uncertainty. His torch dimmed, shrinking into a trembling ember that illuminated only the edges of his hood, leaving his expression hidden, but not his fear. Solomon sensed the fracture widening in the ranks before him, the subtle shifting of feet, the quiver in a rider's breath, the way one Klansman's shoulders collapsed inward as though shrinking from a truth too large to deny. The Marines did not advance, they didn't need to. Their stillness itself became an act of power, a reminder that men who had once crawled out of foxholes under enemy fire would not yield to hooded threats armed only with hatred and fire. The forest seemed to lean back, creating a silent corridor between the two forces, as though nature itself wished to witness the unraveling of a long-held illusion. Lewis Carter's gaze flicked momentarily toward the tree line, measuring shadows for hidden movement, but the woods remained loyal to silence. Private Brooks tightened his jaw, the faint glimmer of torchlight revealing the tension carved into his cheekbones, while Haynes steadied his posture, placing himself half a step ahead of the others, with the unconscious instinct of a man accustomed to shielding those beside him. Their formation, sharpened by years of military precision, radiated a quiet readiness that made the Klansmen appear not as hunters but trespassers in a land that refused to bow. The second rider, still struggling with his frightened horse, finally lowered his torch, its flames sputtering like a dying breath. His shoulders shook visibly, the rigid frame of intimidation dissolving into something painfully human, fear, raw and unmasked. The lead rider swallowed hard, a faint sound beneath his hood, then straightened his spine in a final attempt to reclaim the night. "You're making a mistake," he rasped, but the words fell flat, hollow, stripped of the weight they once carried. Solomon took one deliberate step forward, his boots whispering through the pine needles, and for the first time the clan flinched collectively. The firelight touched Solomon's face, revealing neither hatred nor rage, but a steady resolve forged in foxholes and carried through battles where the price of hesitation was death. "No," he answered quietly. "The mistake was believing we'd fear you forever." His words settled over the clearing like a verdict. The flames crackled, the horses snorted nervously, and in that fragile silence, the truth became unmistakable. The clan's reign over the night had broken, shattered not by bullets, but by the unshakable presence of men who refused to bow again. The forest darkened, as if the moon itself had retreated behind a veil, leaving only the trembling glow of the torches to carve shapes into the night. The lead rider's breath grew uneven, fogging through, the cloth of his hood in shallow bursts that betrayed the unraveling of his confidence. Behind him, one robed figure took another cautious step back, boots sinking softly into the pine needles with a sound far louder than he intended. Solomon watched the retreat with a steady gaze, feeling the subtle shift in the air, a surrender not yet spoken, but already alive in the trembling posture of the men who had once believed fear was their inheritance. The clearing pulsed with a quiet power, each heartbeat amplifying the truth that the night now leaned toward the Marines, not the Hoods. And in that moment, Solomon felt something deeper stirring, the knowledge that dignity, once awakened, could eclipse even the oldest terror. Lewis Carter moved closer, his silhouette framed by the swaying torchlight, revealing the disciplined poise that had carried him through battles most men never lived long enough to recount. His voice broke the tension, low and deliberate. "You rode out. You're expecting ghosts," he said, eyes fixed on the riders. "But ghosts don't stand their ground." The words hung in the air, neither boast nor challenge, simply truth. Private Brooks steadied his stance, his breath forming delicate clouds in the chilled night air, while Haynes slowly shifted his weight, anchoring the formation with the quiet certainty of a man who knew retreat was no longer possible for either side. The Marines did not raise their rifles. They didn't need to. Their presence alone, calm, unbroken, pressed against the clan with a force that felt heavier than any weapon. The robed men began exchanging frantic glances beneath their hoods, searching for guidance from leaders who suddenly appeared small. A gust of wind surged through the clearing, scattering sparks upward in a spiral of amber light that painted every face, revealing fear where pride had once lived. The second rider, still struggling to control his restless horse, finally found his voice. "Let's go," he muttered sharply, but the words sounded more like a plea than a command. The others shifted, unsure, their robes rustling in the darkness like wilted banners. Solomon took another measured step, not to intimidate, but to make the choice undeniable. His voice reached them, carried gently by the wind, yet heavy with conviction. "Leave this place," he said, "and understand. Tonight wasn't chance. It was the end of your hold on this road." The words settled like embers across the clearing. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the lead rider tugged at his reins, the leather groaning under the strain of his trembling hands. The night exhaled, and the forest waited to see if they would heed the command. The lead rider's reins trembled in his grip as his horse shifted nervously beneath him, hooves scraping shallow furrows into the forest floor. The torchlight flickered across his hood, revealing the faintest contour of hesitation, an emotion he had likely never allowed himself to feel in daylight. Solomon watched him carefully, sensing the moment the man's will began to fracture like old timber under strain. Behind the rider, two robed figures exchanged uneasy whispers, their words muffled by fabric and fear, while another shifted closer to the path they had come from, his steps slow and unsteady. The night pressed heavier around them, thick with the truth that their dominion over the dark had slipped through their fingers. And still, the Marines stood motionless, the calm of seasoned warriors radiating from their formation like a steady pulse against the trembling chaos before them. Lewis Carter's silhouette edged forward, his boots moving with the deliberation of a man who understood how to command space without lifting a weapon. His breath steamed in the cold air, rising like a quiet testament to endurance. He looked directly at the lead rider, speaking in a measured tone that carried both warning and clarity. "You brought fire where you thought no one would stand against it," he said. "Now you've learned we're not shadows. You can't burn us away." The rider's shoulders sagged at the words, the once impenetrable posture of authority beginning to dissolve. Private Brooks adjusted his stance, each movement precise and controlled, while Haynes anchored the line with a quiet strength that deepened the Klan's unraveling. The torches hissed faintly, their flames shrinking as though exhausted by the tension hanging in the air. A sudden crack echoed from deep in the woods, a dry branch snapping under the weight of something unseen, and the Klan flinched as one, turning their heads with frantic urgency. The sound wasn't threatening, but in their panic, it became thunder. The horses skittered, tossing their heads, challenging the unsteady hands that held them. Solomon stepped into the moment with a calm so profound it seemed to still the very air. "This is over," he said, his voice low, firm, and unshaken. "Leave while you still carry the choice in your own hands." His words landed like a final verdict. The lead rider's breath hitched, then he tugged sharply at the reins. The horse turned grudgingly. One by one, the others followed, robes brushing against bark, torches dimming as they retreated into the path from which they had come. The clearing exhaled, slow, deep, relieved, as the night reclaimed the space once dominated by fear, leaving only the Marines. Standing beneath the silent, watchful pines, the forest swallowed the last echoes of hooves as the riders disappeared down the narrow path, their torches dwindling into distant, trembling stars before finally vanishing altogether. The darkness that followed was fuller, deeper, yet no longer hostile. It felt reclaimed, as though the pines themselves exhaled after holding their breath for far too long. Solomon remained still, watching the final ember fade beyond the tree line, his jaw set, his breath steady. The cold air pressed gently against his skin, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp soil, mingled with the faint, fading tang of burned pitch from the torches. The night, once brimming with the Klan's arrogance, now pulsed with a different energy, quiet, resolute, shaped by the presence of men who had refused to yield an inch of dignity. For the first time in a long while, Solomon felt the land stand beside him rather than against him. Lewis Carter released a slow breath, the rise and fall of his chest easing the rigid tension that had anchored him in place. The faint moonlight broke through the canopy, sketching pale lines across his face, revealing exhaustion tempered by pride. He glanced at Solomon, the unspoken bond of shared survival passing silently between them. Private Brooks lowered his shoulders, the adrenaline draining from his limbs like the receding of a tide, while Haynes stepped forward, towing the spot where the rider's tracks had churned the earth. The forest floor, roughed and scarred by the confrontation, bore witness to a moment that would ripple far beyond the clearing. "They'll talk about this," Haynes murmured, more to himself than anyone else. His words drifted into the night like a soft prophecy, not boastful, simply true. Solomon nodded, his gaze fixed on the path. "Let them," he said quietly. "Truth needs shadows to die." The wind stirred again, this time gently, brushing through the branches as if offering benediction. The tension that had wrapped the clearing so tightly loosened, replaced by a solemn stillness that settled over the Marines like a mantle. Solomon turned, scanning the faces of the men beside him, brothers not by blood, but by battle, by burden, by the shared understanding of what it meant to defend a home that did not defend them in return. Their weapons remained lowered, their posture steady, but a new fire flickered behind their eyes, a fire shaped not by rage, but by purpose. As the moonlight widened, pushing deeper into the clearing, Solomon felt the weight of the night shift from conflict to consequence. They had stood, they had held, and though danger had walked into the forest with full intent, it had left broken. The land was silent now, but it was not empty. Something larger had taken root. Something fierce, something righteous, something that would not disappear when morning broke. The moon drifted higher, thinning its light across the forest like a pale ribbon, illuminating the Marines as they gathered in the center of the clearing. Their breaths formed slow clouds that rose into the cold night air, dissolving among the towering pines. Solomon knelt beside the churned earth, running his fingers lightly through the disturbed soil where the riders had once stood. The ground felt cold but alive, as though it held the memory of every footstep, every tremor of tension, every heartbeat that had thundered against its roots. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the stillness settle through him. It wasn't triumph he felt. It was something quieter, deeper. A recognition that the line drawn tonight was not just for themselves, but for every black family who lived under the weight of unspoken fear. The forest, once the Klan's chosen stage for terror, now carried the echo of resistance. Lewis Carter watched him, arms crossed, gaze steady. "You think they'll come back?" he asked, though the question held no fear, only calculation. Solomon rose slowly, brushing pine needles from his palms, and looked toward the dark path where the riders had vanished. "Yes," he answered, "not tonight. But fear doesn't surrender. It hides. It waits." His voice carried no bitterness, only truth shaped by years of fighting enemies who refused to appear only when convenient. Private Brooks shifted beside him, jaw tightening with frustration. "Then what we did here, does it change anything?" he asked. Solomon turned to face him fully, the faint moonlight carving a solemn glow along his features. "It changes everything," he replied. "Not because they left, but because we didn't." The words lingered, steady as the roots beneath their feet. Haynes stepped closer, his breath forming pale mist as he exhaled. "People will hear," he said. "They always do. Stories travel faster than footsteps." Solomon nodded, feeling the truth resonate in his chest like a slow drumbeat. "Let it spread," he answered. "Let it reach porches and church aisles. Let them know the night isn't theirs anymore." The men stood in quiet agreement, bound not by orders, but by the unspoken vow formed in the clearing, an oath that what they'd done tonight was only the beginning of a new kind of watch. As the wind threaded through the branches above, carrying the faint scent of charred resin and fading fear, Solomon felt the night shift into something sacred. They had reclaimed the darkness, if only for a moment, and that moment would be enough to ignite courage in those who had spent their lives learning to survive in silence. The night began to pale at its edges, a faint silver thinning the darkness as the first whisper of dawn crept between the needles of the pines. The Marines lingered in the clearing, their silhouettes softened by the early light. Each man feeling the weight of what had transpired settle into the quiet chambers of his spirit. Solomon stood slightly apart from the others, his gaze lifted toward the horizon, where a fragile line of grey announced the approaching day. The forest no longer felt like enemy territory. It felt like a witness, a keeper of truth that had long been silenced. The wind brushed through the branches with a gentleness he had not felt since returning from war, as though the land itself offered acknowledgement. He closed his eyes, letting that peace wash through him, knowing it would not last, but grateful for its brief, precious presence. Lewis Carter approached, his steps slow, the tension finally easing from his shoulders. He glanced toward the path where the Klan had fled, now swallowed completely by the deepening morning mist. "News of this will spread before sunrise," he murmured, his voice low but certain. Solomon nodded, the corners of his mouth tightening with a mix of resolve and melancholy. "Let it," he replied softly. "Fear changes when it has to look a man in the eyes." Behind them, Brooks and Haynes knelt near the churned soil, their hands pressed briefly to the earth, as if acknowledging the place where courage had broken through centuries of intimidation. None of them smiled. None of them spoke of victory. What they felt was something far older, an understanding that they had taken back a piece of the world that had never been freely offered. A piece carved not with violence, but with unyielding presence. As they turned to leave the clearing, the early light stretched long, shadows behind them, weaving their forms into the forest floor like threads in a larger tapestry. Solomon glanced back once more, knowing these woods would be different now, not safer, not healed, but changed. The night that had begun with the sound of approaching hooves had ended with silence and dignity reclaimed. As they walked toward the small road that led back to their community, the first bird calls reached through the branches, tentative but brave. Solomon breathed deeply, feeling the weight of the coming struggle settle into his bones, not as a burden, but as a calling. What happened in that clearing would become more than memory. It would become a seed, and seeds, even buried in shadows, learn to rise.